This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, and situations are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental.
The great hall fell silent when Emperor Cassian Aurelius entered, and it wasn't reverence that stopped the heir, it was fear. He moved through the marble corridors like winter itself, his boots clicking against stone with the precision of a blade finding bone. Advisors bowed without meeting his eyes. Senators whispered prayers they hoped he wouldn't hear. And at the far end of the chamber, pressed against a column as if hoping the stone would swallow her whole, stood Lyria Vale, a woman the world had spent 23 years pretending didn't exist. She had been summoned, though no one had bothered to tell her why. She only knew that when an emperor calls, you come, even if you're no one, especially if you're no one. He stopped 3 feet away from her, close enough that she could see the silver threading through his dark hair, the faint scar above his left brow, the exhaustion buried so deep in his gray eyes it looked like resignation. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he studied her the way a general studies a map before a battle, not with curiosity, but with cold calculation. She kept her gaze lowered, her hands folded, her breathing shallow. This was how invisible women survived powerful men, by making themselves smaller, quieter, less. Then he leaned forward, just slightly, and whispered 6 words that would unravel everything she thought she understood about survival. Pretend the baby is mine. His voice was low, steady, and carried the weight of an empire that had forgotten how to bend. He didn't ask. He didn't explain. He simply expected her to agree, because women like her, women who had been rejected by every family, every institution, every chance at belonging, didn't get to say no to men like him. And the most terrifying part? She didn't want to. If this story is already pulling at something inside you, don't let it slip away. Subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Leave a like if you believe some people are worth choosing, even when the world says otherwise. And tell me in the comments, would you accept a lie if it meant finally being seen? Lyria had learned early that invisibility was safer than hope. She'd been born in a charity ward on the eastern edge of the capital, the daughter of a woman whose name no one bothered recording and a father who never appeared. The nuns who raised her had been kind in the mechanical way institutions teach kindness. Efficient, distant, never cruel, but never warm. By the time she turned 16, she'd been passed between 3 households as a servant, each one releasing her with the same hollow excuse. We simply don't have the space anymore. It wasn't about space. It was about the way she made people uncomfortable by existing without explanation, without family, without the social scaffolding that made a person real. So she stopped trying to be seen and started perfecting the art of blending into walls. The imperial palace had hired her 6 months ago to assist in the nursery wing, a section of the sprawling estate that hadn't been used in over a decade. The previous empress had died in childbirth along with the heir, a tragedy that had carved something permanent and cold into Emperor Cassian's face. The court still whispered about it in hallways when they thought no one was listening. How he'd shut down entire wings of the palace, how he refused to remarry despite the Senate's relentless pressure, how he ruled with a precision that felt less like leadership and more like controlled fury. Lyria had seen him exactly twice before today, once from a balcony as he passed through the gardens below, and once in a corridor where she'd pressed herself so flat against the stone she might as well have been mortar. He hadn't noticed her either time. No one ever did. But now he had, and she couldn't understand why. The baby he'd mentioned. Whose baby? His? Impossible. The entire empire would have known if the emperor had fathered a child. A mistress, perhaps? A political arrangement? None of it made sense, but Lyria had learned long ago that sense was a luxury reserved for people who mattered. She was being asked to play a role, and the script didn't require her understanding, only her compliance. So when the emperor's chief steward, a skeletal man named Dorian with eyes like frozen lakes, appeared at her quarters that evening with a black velvet dress and instructions to make yourself presentable for the morning, she didn't ask questions. She simply nodded, took the dress, and wondered if this was what it felt like to be chosen, even if the choosing was a lie. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the narrow window of her servant's chamber, staring out at the palace gardens bathed in moonlight, and tried to imagine what kind of desperation would drive an emperor to need someone like her. Desperation was something she understood. It was the feeling of watching other girls get adopted while you aged out of eligibility. It was the sensation of being handed from household to household, like a book no one wanted to finish. It was the quiet, gnawing certainty that you were born into a world that had already decided you didn't belong. If the Emperor was desperate enough to ask her to pretend, then perhaps, just perhaps, he knew what it felt like to be unseen too. The thought was almost comforting. Almost. When dawn broke, she dressed in the black velvet gown that fit her too well to have been chosen at random. Someone had measured her without her knowing. Someone had planned this. The fabric was heavy, expensive, and made her feel like she was wearing someone else's skin. She braided her dark hair simply, the way the nuns had taught her, and avoided the mirror because she didn't want to see herself pretending to be someone important. Dorian arrived precisely at sunrise, his expression unreadable, and led her through corridors she'd never been allowed to enter. They passed senators who didn't bother hiding their confusion, noblewomen who studied her with the sharp assessment of predators evaluating prey, and guards whose hands rested too casually on their sword hilts. No one spoke to her. No one smiled. And when they finally reached the Emperor's private study, Dorian knocked twice, opened the door without waiting for permission, and gestured for her to enter alone. The study was smaller than she'd expected, almost intimate, lined with maps and books that looked genuinely read rather than decoratively displayed. Emperor Cassian stood with his back to her, hands clasped behind him, staring out a window that overlooked the northern mountains. He didn't turn when she entered. He didn't acknowledge her presence at all for nearly a full minute, and Lyria wondered if she was supposed to speak first, to curtsy, to apologize for breathing his air. But then he spoke, his voice quiet and eerily calm. "Close the door." She did. The click of the latch felt final, like the ceiling of a tomb. He still didn't turn. "Do you know why you're here?" She swallowed. "No, Your Majesty." He exhaled slowly, as if her honesty had confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Good. That makes this easier." He turned then, and she saw him clearly for the first time, not as a distant figure of power, but as a man. There were shadows under his eyes that no amount of imperial authority could hide. His jaw was tight, his shoulders rigid, and his hands, when he finally unclasped them, trembled just slightly before he forced them still. He looked like someone who had been holding himself together through sheer will for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to let go. 3 months ago, he said, his tone clinical. A child was brought to me. A boy. An infant. He was born to a woman I knew briefly, years ago, before I became emperor. She died in childbirth. The child is mine. He paused, watching her face for a reaction she didn't know how to give. The Senate doesn't know. The court doesn't know. And if they find out the truth, that I fathered a bastard son with a commoner, they will tear this empire apart, fighting over whether he has any claim to the throne. Lyria's mind raced, trying to follow the implications, but he continued before she could fully process. I need the child to be legitimate. I need the story to be that he was born within the bounds of a private, sanctioned union. And I need a woman the court will believe I married in secret, someone quiet, unremarkable, someone who won't draw attention or ask for power. His gray eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her feel like she was being dissected. You are that woman. You have no family to contest the arrangement, no social circle to gossip, no ambitions that would threaten the stability of the throne. You are, in every measurable way, perfectly invisible. The words should have stung, but they didn't. They were simply true. And truthfully, she'd been called worse by better people. What exactly are you asking me to do? Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. He tilted his head slightly as if surprised she had the audacity to ask for clarification. I'm asking you to stand beside me when I present the child to the Senate in 2 weeks. I'm asking you to let them believe you are my wife, that this child is ours, and that our union was kept private for security reasons. You'll live in the palace. You'll be given quarters befitting an empress. You'll attend state functions when required. And in return, you'll have protection, status, and a place in this world that no one can take from you. He said it like he was offering her a business contract, not a life. Maybe to him it was the same thing. She should have been terrified. She should have refused. But all she could think was that for the first time in 23 years, someone was offering her a reason to stay. Not out of pity, not out of charity, but because she served a purpose, because she was useful. It wasn't love. It wasn't even kindness, but it was more than she'd ever been given before. And after? She asked quietly. After the Senate accepts the child as legitimate? He looked at her for a long moment, and something flickered in his expression. Something that might have been regret or possibly respect. After, you'll remain as long as it serves us both. If you wish to leave, arrangements will be made. You'll be compensated. But until then, you are the empress of this realm, at least in name. He extended his hand, not in affection, but in formality. Do we have an agreement? Lyria stared at his outstretched hand. It was a strong hand, scarred along the knuckles, calloused in ways that suggested he hadn't always ruled from a throne. It was the hand of a man who had fought for power and paid for it in ways that didn't show on official records. And she realized in that moment that he wasn't asking her to love him. He wasn't even asking her to trust him. He was asking her to be complicit in a survival strategy that benefited them both. She'd survived worse bargains with far less to gain. So she reached out, her smaller hand disappearing into his, and felt the coldness of his skin against hers. We have an agreement, Your Majesty. His grip tightened just briefly, enough to seal the pact, and then he released her. Good. Dorian will arrange everything. And Lyria? He paused, her name sounding strange in his mouth like a word in a language he'd forgotten. Thank you. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and he seemed to prefer it that way. The quarters they gave her were obscene. 3 rooms connected by arched doorways, each one larger than any place she'd ever lived, with ceilings so high her voice echoed when she whispered to herself. There was a bedroom with a 4-poster bed draped in silk the color of deep wine, a sitting room with velvet chairs positioned near a fireplace that actually worked, and a bathing chamber with a marble tub large enough to drown in. Servants appeared without being summoned, laying out gowns she hadn't requested, filling the tub with water scented like roses, and something else she couldn't name, something expensive. They didn't speak to her. They didn't ask her preferences. They simply moved around her like she was a piece of furniture that needed decorating, and when they left, the silence that remained felt heavier than anything she'd ever carried. She spent the first night sitting on the floor beside the bed rather than in it, because the mattress felt too soft, too foreign, like something that didn't belong to her and never would. She kept expecting someone to burst through the door and tell her there had been a mistake, that girls like her didn't get rooms like this, that she needed to go back to the servants' quarters where she belonged. But no one came. The night stretched on in eerie stillness, broken only by the distant sound of guards changing posts and the occasional creak of old wood settling. Somewhere in this massive palace, there was a baby. A child who didn't know yet that his entire existence had been rewritten to fit a political narrative. She wondered if he cried at night. She wondered if anyone held him when he did. The next morning, Dorian appeared with a woman named Celeste, the palace's head of protocol, a sharp-eyed creature in her 50s who looked at Lyria the way a sculptor looks at unworked marble, with a mixture of possibility and disdain. You'll need to be taught, Celeste said without preamble, circling Lyria like a predator assessing weakness. How to stand, how to speak, how to hold a wine glass without looking like you're afraid it'll shatter. The Senate is already suspicious. If you walk into that chamber looking like a frightened servant, they'll tear this entire story apart before the Emperor finishes his first sentence. Lyria nodded, keeping her face neutral. She'd spent years learning how to absorb criticism without flinching. This was just another version of the same lesson. For the next 10 days, Celeste drilled her relentlessly. Posture, diction, the correct way to acknowledge a senator without appearing subservient, how to smile without showing teeth, how to walk in heeled shoes that felt like instruments of torture designed by someone who hated women. Lyria absorbed it all with the grim determination of someone who knew that failure meant being thrown back into invisibility, and invisibility, she'd learned, was just a slower kind of dying. Celeste never complimented her, she only corrected. But on the 8th day, after Lyria had walked the length of the training hall 3 times without stumbling, Celeste paused and said, "You'll do." It wasn't praise, but coming from her, it was close enough. The Emperor didn't visit her once during those 10 days. She saw him only in passing, once through a window as he met with military advisors in the courtyard below, once in a corridor where he walked past her without acknowledgement, his face a mask of imperial indifference. She told herself it didn't matter. This was a transaction, not a relationship. He didn't owe her attention. But late at night, alone in her too large bed, she couldn't help but wonder what he was thinking, if he regretted choosing her, if he was already planning her replacement, if he ever thought about her at all. And the fact that she cared, even a little, terrified her more than anything Celeste had ever said. On the 11th day, a servant arrived at dawn with a message written in the Emperor's own hand. She recognized the sharp, controlled script from documents she'd glimpsed in his study. "You will meet the child today. 3rd floor, western wing, nursery chamber. Come alone." No greeting. No signature. Just instructions delivered with the emotional warmth of a military order. She dressed carefully in a simple gray gown that Celeste had approved as appropriate for private maternal duties, braided her hair, and made her way through the maze of corridors that still felt like someone else's home. The nursery wing was quieter than the rest of the palace, insulated by thick walls and carpeted floors that swallowed sound. She found the chamber easily, the only door with light seeping beneath it. She knocked softly. No response. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, and the first thing she saw was Emperor Cassian Aurelius sitting in a rocking chair near the window, holding a baby against his chest with a gentleness that seemed to contradict everything she knew about him. The infant was perhaps 3 months old, small and fragile, with a tuft of dark hair and skin still carrying the translucent quality of the very new. He wasn't crying. He was simply staring up at the Emperor's face with the solemn curiosity of someone trying to understand the world one detail at a time. And the Emperor, this man who ruled with absolute authority, who commanded armies and bent nations to his will, was looking at the child with an expression so raw and unguarded, it felt like witnessing something holy. He didn't notice her immediately. Or perhaps he did and chose not to acknowledge her, unwilling to break whatever fragile spell existed in that moment. She stood frozen in the doorway, unsure whether to speak or retreat, and then the baby made a small sound, not quite a cry, more like a question, and Cassian's attention shifted. He looked up and saw her, and for a split second, something like embarrassment flickered across his face before the imperial mask slid back into place. "Close the door," he said quietly. She did. He stood slowly, cradling the baby with a care that suggested he'd done this before, many times, and crossed the room to where she stood. "This is Elian," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Your son. At least that's what the world will believe." Lyria looked down at the child and felt something crack open inside her chest. Not love, not yet, but something close to recognition. She knew what it was like to be unwanted, to exist because of circumstances no one had planned for, to carry the weight of other people's mistakes and somehow be expected to justify your own survival. This baby had no idea yet what role he'd been born into, what lies had been constructed around his existence, what fragile foundation his entire future rested on. But she knew, and maybe that was enough. "May I?" she asked, extending her arms slightly. Cassian hesitated, just for a moment, and she saw it. The fear of letting go, the worry that trust was just another word for loss. But then he nodded and carefully transferred the baby into her arms. Elian was lighter than she'd expected, warm and impossibly small, and when he looked up at her with those dark, serious eyes, she felt the full weight of what she'd agreed to. This wasn't just pretending for the Senate. This wasn't just playing a role at state functions. This was becoming responsible for a life that had already been shaped by secrets and compromises before it could even speak. She adjusted her hold instinctively, supporting his head the way the nuns had taught her when she'd helped with younger orphans, and Elian settled against her chest with a sigh that sounded almost like relief. She looked up to find Cassian watching her with an expression she couldn't read, something between assessment and something softer, something he probably didn't have a name for. "He doesn't cry much," Cassian said after a long silence, his voice carefully neutral. "The nurses say it's unusual for an infant, They worry he's too quiet. Lyria looked down at Elian, at the way his tiny fingers had curled around the fabric of her dress, and shook her head slowly. He's not too quiet. He's just learning who he can trust. She said it without thinking, and when she realized what she'd implied, that this baby, like her, had already learned that the world wasn't safe, she expected Cassian to dismiss the observation as sentimental nonsense. But he didn't. Instead, he nodded, just once, and something in his eyes shifted. "Then we teach him," he said quietly, "that he can trust us." It was the first time he'd used the word us as if it meant something real. And despite everything, despite the lies, the arrangement, the cold transaction that had brought them to this moment, Lyria found herself believing him. The presentation to the Senate was scheduled for the following week, and the preparation consumed the palace like a slow-burning fire. Seamstresses appeared to fit Lyria for a ceremonial gown, ivory silk with gold embroidery that caught the light like captured sunlight, designed to make her look regal without threatening the memory of the previous empress. Celeste coached her on exactly how to stand beside the emperor, how to hold Elian so the senators could see his face but not close enough to appear possessive, how to smile with warmth but not joy, because joy would seem inappropriate for a union that had been kept secret due to matters of imperial security. Every detail was choreographed, every gesture calculated, and Lyria absorbed it all while wondering if this was what it meant to be powerful, to have your entire existence reduced to performance. Cassian began spending more time in the nursery, though he never announced his visits and rarely stayed long. He would appear in the doorway, watch silently as Lyria fed or changed Elian, and occasionally offer terse observations about the child's health or sleeping patterns. He never touched her, never stood too close. But his presence filled the room in a way that made her hyper-aware of every movement, every breath. Once, when Elian had been fussing for nearly an hour and Lyria's arms ached from rocking him, Cassian crossed the room without a word, took the baby from her, and walked to the window, humming something low and rhythmic that she didn't recognize. Within minutes, Elian was asleep. Cassian placed him gently in the cradle, turned to leave, and paused at the door. "My mother used to sing that," he said quietly, not looking at her, "before she died." Then he was gone. She began to notice things about him, small details that the rest of the court either missed or chose to ignore. The way his left hand trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching, a remnant of some old injury or perhaps just the physical manifestation of constant control. The fact that he ate alone in his study rather than in the great hall, because dining with the court required a performance he couldn't sustain 3 times a day. The shadows under his eyes that deepened each morning, suggesting sleep was something he rationed rather than enjoyed. He was, she realized, profoundly lonely. Not in the way she had been lonely, the loneliness of being unwanted, but in the loneliness of being untouchable, of occupying a position so elevated that genuine human connection became structurally impossible. 3 days before the Senate presentation, Dorian summoned her to the Emperor's private chambers, not the study, but his actual living quarters, a space she'd been told was off-limits to everyone except his personal guards. She found Cassian standing at a table covered in documents, his jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up, looking more exhausted than she'd ever seen him. He gestured for her to sit, poured 2 glasses of wine without asking if she wanted any, and slid one across the table toward her. "We need to discuss our story," he said, his tone clinical. "The Senate will ask questions, how we met, when we married, why it was kept secret. We need our answers to align perfectly or they'll smell the lie." She nodded, taking a small sip of the wine. It was excellent, which somehow made it harder to swallow. They spent the next 2 hours constructing a narrative, a carefully balanced fiction that threaded the needle between believable and expedient. They had met, they decided, during a diplomatic tour of the eastern provinces 2 years ago. She had been working as a translator for a minor noble house. He had noticed her competence, her discretion. They had corresponded privately. The connection had deepened. They had married in a small, private ceremony, witnessed only by Dorian and a priest who had since passed away, convenient and unverifiable. The secrecy had been necessary due to ongoing threats against the imperial family, true enough that it wouldn't be questioned. Elian had been born 8 months later, premature but healthy. Every detail was plausible. Every answer anticipated. And yet, as they rehearsed the lies together, Lyria couldn't shake the feeling that they were building a prison they'd both have to live in. The night before the presentation, Lyria couldn't sleep. She stood at the window of her chambers, staring out at the city below, thousands of lights flickering in the darkness, each one representing a life being lived by people who had no idea their empire's future rested on a lie. She thought about all the ways this could fall apart. A servant who remembered her from the lower quarters. A senator with connections to the eastern provinces who could verify she'd never worked as a translator. A single inconsistency in their story that would unravel everything. And beneath the practical fears ran something deeper. The terror that even if the lie succeeded, she would spend the rest of her life pretending to be someone she wasn't, locked in a role that felt both too large and too small to contain her. A knock at her door startled her. It was well past midnight, and no servant would disturb her at this hour without explicit permission. She opened the door to find Cassian standing in the hallway, still fully dressed, his expression unreadable. "May I come in?" It was the first time he'd ever asked her permission for anything. She stepped aside and he entered, his eyes sweeping the room before settling on her. "You're afraid," he said. Not a question, an observation. She saw no point in denying it. "Yes." He nodded slowly, as if her honesty had confirmed something. "So am I." The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and unexpected. She'd never heard him confess weakness before, never seen him as anything other than the architect of absolute control. He moved to the window where she'd been standing, keeping a careful distance, and looked out at the same city she'd been contemplating. "When my wife and son died," he said quietly, "I swore I would never allow myself to be vulnerable again. Vulnerability is what kills emperors. It's what turns kingdoms into graveyards. So I built walls, not just around the palace, but around everything I am. I ruled through fear because fear is predictable. Fear is manageable. And for 12 years, it worked." He paused, his jaw tightening. But fear doesn't raise children, and it doesn't build futures. It only protects what already exists. And what I've built, it's not enough anymore. He turned to look at her then, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Doubt maybe, or something close to hope. "I need you to know that this arrangement, this lie we're about to tell, it's not just political convenience. That child needs a mother, not a nurse, not a caretaker. A mother, and I need to remember what it feels like to trust someone." Lyria felt her throat tighten. She wanted to tell him that she wasn't qualified for this, that she'd never been anyone's first choice for anything, that mothers were supposed to be women who knew how to love instinctively and she'd never been taught. But instead, what came out was the truth she'd been avoiding since the moment he'd first whispered those 6 words in the Great Hall. "I don't know how to be what you're asking me to be." Her voice cracked slightly. "I don't know how to pretend to be an empress. I don't know how to convince a room full of powerful men that I belong beside you. And I don't know how to love a child who isn't mine without being terrified that someone will take him away the moment I start to care." The words spilled out of her like a confession, raw and unfiltered, and she waited for him to dismiss her fears, to remind her that she'd already agreed, that it was too late to back out now. But he didn't. Instead, he took a step closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion etched into every line of his face, the weight he carried that no crown could adequately symbolize. "Then we learn together," he said softly. "Because I don't know how to do this either. I don't know how to be a father to a child I barely know. I don't know how to ask for help without it feeling like surrender. And I certainly don't know how to trust someone I've only known for 2 weeks with the future of an entire empire." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His skin was warm this time, not cold like it had been when they'd first made their agreement, and his grip was gentle rather than formal. "But tomorrow, when we walk into that Senate chamber, we walk in together. Not as emperor and servant, not even as husband and wife, but as 2 people who are trying to give that child something neither of us ever had, a place to belong." Lyria looked down at their joined hands and felt something shift inside her. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of something that might one day become it. Trust was a luxury she'd never been able to afford, and he was offering it to her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She lifted her eyes to meet his and saw, for the first time, not the great emperor, but Cassian. Just a man who had been alone for too long and was tired of pretending he didn't need anyone. Together, she repeated softly, the word feeling like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep, but was willing to try. He nodded, squeezed her hand once, and then released it, stepping back toward the door. He paused at the threshold, his hand on the frame, and looked back at her one last time. "Get some sleep, Lyria. Tomorrow we change everything." And then he was gone, leaving her standing in the middle of her too large room, her hand still warm from his touch, wondering if it was possible for a lie to become true simply by believing in it hard enough. The Senate chamber was designed to intimidate. Vaulted ceilings stretched so high they disappeared into shadow, and marble columns lined the walls like silent sentinels judging everyone who entered. Senators sat in tiered rows, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility, their robes marking rank and influence through subtle variations in color and embroidery. At the center of it all stood a raised dais where the emperor's throne waited, gilded, imposing, and utterly isolated. Lyria had been brought in through a side entrance an hour before the session began, dressed in the ivory and gold gown that made her feel like an ornament rather than a person. Celeste had done her hair in an elaborate style that pulled at her scalp, applied cosmetics that made her face feel like a mask, and reminded her one final time to keep her chin up and her hands steady. "They're looking for weakness," Celeste had whispered. "Don't give them any." Now she stood in a small antechamber just off the main hall, holding Elian against her chest, listening to the murmur of voices beyond the door as senators argued about trade disputes and military budgets, the routine business of empire that would be interrupted by the emperor's announcement. Elian was awake but quiet, his dark eyes tracking the shadows on the wall with solemn focus. She wondered what he sensed, if babies could feel the weight of their own futures pressing down before they had words to name it. A guard appeared at the door and nodded once. It was time. She took a breath that didn't quite fill her lungs and stepped into the corridor where Cassian was waiting. He looked every inch the emperor today, dressed in black and deep crimson, a circlet of gold resting on his dark hair, his expression carved from stone. But when his eyes met hers, she saw the same uncertainty she felt, hidden beneath layers of practiced control. He offered her his arm without speaking, and she took it, feeling the rigid tension in his muscles beneath the expensive fabric. Together they walked toward the massive doors that led into the Senate chamber. The guards pulled them open, and the room fell silent so abruptly it felt like the air itself had been cut. Every eye turned toward them, every breath held. And then Cassian began walking forward, and Lyria had no choice but to follow, her heeled shoes clicking against marble in rhythm with his steady stride. He led her to the dais, where two thrones now sat instead of one, the second clearly added recently, smaller but no less ornate. He handed her up the steps with a formality that suggested this had been rehearsed, which it had, and waited until she was seated before taking his own throne. Only then did he speak, his voice carrying across the chamber with the absolute authority of someone who had never needed to raise it. "Senators of the Empire, I have called this session to address a matter of succession and to correct a deliberate omission in the public record." The room seemed to lean forward collectively. 2 years ago, during a diplomatic tour of the eastern provinces, I met Lyria Vale. She served as a translator and cultural advisor. Over time, our professional relationship became personal. 18 months ago, we were married in a private ceremony, kept secret due to credible threats against the imperial family. 8 months ago, she gave birth to our son. He paused, letting the words settle like stones dropped into still water. "I present to you Empress Lyria and the heir to the throne, Elian Aurelius." The silence that followed was absolute. Lyria could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes dissecting her, measuring her, searching for any sign that the story was false. She kept her expression serene, her posture straight, and focused on the rhythm of Elian's breathing against her chest to keep herself grounded. Then the questions began. Senator Marcellus, an older man with silver hair and a reputation for political ruthlessness, stood first. Your Majesty, forgive my bluntness, but this claim is extraordinary. Why was the Senate not informed of this marriage when it occurred? Why were we not consulted about the succession? Cassian's expression didn't flicker. Because consultation implies negotiation, Senator. And my choice of consort is not subject to Senate approval. The marriage was kept private to protect my family from the same forces that took my first wife and son. That threat has now been neutralized. The secrecy is no longer necessary. Another senator rose, a younger man with calculating eyes and a voice like sharpened steel. And what of the woman herself? Lyria Vale is not a name known to any noble house. What is her lineage? What family claims her? The question was designed to expose her, to reveal the lie through her lack of pedigree, and Lyria felt her heart hammering against her ribs. But Cassian answered before she could even consider speaking, his tone dropping several degrees in temperature. She is claimed by me, Senator Flavius. That is the only lineage that matters. Or do you suggest that the Emperor's judgment is insufficient to determine the character and suitability of his own wife? The rebuke was subtle but unmistakable, and Flavius sat down, his jaw tight. But the damage was done. The question had been planted. Doubt rippled through the chamber like wind across water. Senator Marcellus wasn't finished. The timing is convenient, Your Majesty. An heir appears precisely when the Senate has been pressuring you to secure the succession. Forgive our skepticism, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. Can the priest who performed the ceremony be summoned? Can witnesses be brought forward? Cassian leaned forward slightly, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The priest has passed. The witnesses were minimal by design. But the child himself is proof enough. He bears the mark of the Aurelius bloodline. He gestured toward Elian, and Lyria understood what he meant. She carefully shifted the baby so the senators could see the birthmark on his left shoulder blade, a distinctive crescent shape that the imperial family had carried for generations. It was documented in official records. Undeniable. Genetic. The murmurs began immediately, senators conferring in whispers, and Lyria saw doubt begin to crack. But then a woman's voice cut through the noise, sharp, aristocratic, and laced with venom. The child may be yours, Your Majesty, but that does not make her his mother. Lyria's eyes found the speaker, Senator Octavia, a woman in her 50s known for her unwavering loyalty to the old noble houses and her disdain for anyone who rose above their station. She stood with the confidence of someone who believed her position was unassailable. A birthmark proves paternity. It proves nothing about this woman's claim. For all we know, she could be a servant you've elevated for convenience, the child's real mother conveniently dead and unable to contest the narrative. The accusation hung in the air like poison, and Lyria felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was the moment Cassian had warned her about, the moment when the lie would be tested not with questions, but with contempt. Cassian's voice, when it came, was lethal. Senator Octavia, you will address the Empress with the respect her position demands, or you will be removed from this chamber. But Octavia didn't back down. Respect must be earned, Your Majesty, and a woman who appears from nowhere, with no family, no history, and no verification, she has earned nothing but suspicion. She turned her gaze directly on Lyria, her eyes like blades. Tell us, Empress, where were you born? Who were your parents? What noble house trained you in the art of translation? Surely, if your story is true, these questions should be simple to answer. Lyria felt every eye in the room turn toward her. This was the trap. Any answer she gave could be investigated, verified, disproven. Silence would confirm guilt. Speaking would risk exposure. She was drowning in front of an audience that wanted to watch her sink. But then she felt something, a small hand gripping her finger. Elian, awake and staring up at her with those impossibly serious eyes, as if he knew that everything depended on this moment. And she realized that Octavia had made a mistake. She hadn't asked about translation credentials or marriage certificates. She'd asked about being a mother. And that was something Lyria actually understood. She stood slowly, carefully, keeping Elian secure in her arms. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. You're right, Senator Octavia. I wasn't born into a noble house. I was born in a charity ward on the eastern edge of the capital. I don't know who my parents were. I was raised by nuns who taught me to read because education was cheaper than caring. And I learned translation not in some aristocratic academy, but by surviving in a city where speaking multiple languages meant the difference between work and starvation. The silence was absolute now, every senator frozen. So no, I don't have the lineage you value. I don't have the pedigree you respect. But I know what it means to be unwanted. I know what it feels like to be judged worthless before you've said a single word. And I know, her voice caught just slightly, that this child will never ever feel that way. Not while I'm breathing. She looked down at Elian, then back at Octavia. You asked what makes me his mother. That does. The chamber remained silent for 3 heartbeats. Then Cassian rose from his throne, and the sound of his movement was like thunder in the stillness. He descended the steps and came to stand beside Lyria, not in front of her, not shielding her, but beside her, a deliberate alignment that every senator understood. The Empress has answered your question, Senator Octavia. If you have further objections to the legitimacy of my son or the honor of my wife, you may submit them in writing to my personal office. This session is concluded. His tone left no room for argument. The chief herald struck his staff against the marble floor 3 times, the signal for dismissal, and slowly, reluctantly, the senators began to rise. But their eyes never left Lyria. She could feel their judgment, their calculation, their resentment rolling toward her in waves. She had exposed herself. She had given them her weakness, and they would use it. Cassian placed his hand at the small of her back, the first time he'd touched her in public, and guided her toward the private exit. They walked in silence through corridors lined with guards who didn't meet their eyes, past servants who bowed but whispered the moment they passed, until finally they reached his private study, and he closed the door behind them with a finality that felt like sealing a wound. He said nothing for a long moment, just stood with his back to the door, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. You shouldn't have told them the truth. It wasn't an accusation. It was something closer to despair. Now they know exactly where to strike. Lyria sat down carefully, still holding Elian, and felt the adrenaline that had carried her through the last hour begin to drain away, leaving only exhaustion. What else could I have said? Any lie I told would have been investigated and disproven within a week. At least the truth is something they can't take apart. Cassian turned to face her, and she saw fear in his eyes. Real, undisguised fear. They don't need to take it apart, Lyria. They just need to make you wish you'd never spoken it. Senator Octavia has connections to half the noble families in the Empire. By tonight, every aristocratic household will know you were born in a charity ward. By tomorrow, they'll be calling you the beggar empress. And by next week... He stopped himself, running a hand through his hair, dislodging the golden circlet so it sat crooked. They'll make your life hell, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. She looked down at Elian, who had fallen asleep against her chest, oblivious to the storm his existence had created. Then I'll endure it, she said quietly. I've endured worse with less reason. Cassian crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair, an emperor kneeling, the gesture so unexpected it stole her breath. He reached out and touched Elian's tiny hand with one finger, and the baby's fingers curled around it instinctively, even in sleep. I didn't want this for you, Cassian said, his voice barely above a whisper. When I asked you to do this, I thought I could protect you. I thought my authority would be enough to keep them at bay. But I forgot. Power doesn't protect people from cruelty. Sometimes it just gives cruelty better weapons. Lyria felt something crack inside her chest. Not breaking, but opening, like a door she'd kept locked her entire life finally giving way. She reached out with her free hand and touched his face, her palm against his jaw, feeling the rough stubble and the tension held there. He froze at the contact, his eyes widening slightly, as if no one had touched him with gentleness in so long he'd forgotten what it felt like. I didn't accept your offer because I thought you could protect me, she said softly. I accepted it because for the first time in my life someone asked me to stay. Not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because I was needed. That's worth enduring anything for. His eyes searched hers, looking for the lie, the performance, the calculation. But there was none. Just the raw truth of a woman who had spent 23 years being invisible and had finally found a reason to be seen. He covered her hand with his own, pressing it more firmly against his face, and closed his eyes. Then I will do everything in my power to make sure you never regret it. It was a vow, not a promise. The kind of oath that came from the same place as marriage vows and battlefield pledges. The kind that couldn't be taken back. When he opened his eyes again, something had shifted between them. The distance that had defined their arrangement, emperor and servant, benefactor and dependent, had collapsed into something neither of them had a name for yet. Something fragile and new and terrifying. He stood slowly, released her hand, and stepped back, rebuilding the professional distance like a man putting on armor. You should rest. The next few days will be difficult. She nodded, rising carefully so as not to wake Elian. But as she moved toward the door, he spoke again. Lyria. She turned. What you said in the Senate chamber, about knowing what it means to be unwanted? He paused, his jaw working as if the words were fighting him. You're not unwanted anymore. I need you to know that. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even affection. But coming from him, it was everything. Cassian had been right about the cruelty. It started small. Whispers that stopped when she entered a room, servants who took just a moment too long to respond to her requests, invitations to court functions that arrived with her name misspelled or her title omitted entirely. Then it escalated. Anonymous letters appeared at her chambers, some questioning Elian's legitimacy, others far crueler, calling her a charlatan, a whore, an opportunist who had seduced a grieving emperor. She burned them without reading past the first few lines, but their existence haunted her anyway. The noblewomen were worse. They smiled to her face with venomous politeness and tore her apart the moment she left, loud enough that she could hear their laughter echoing down marble hallways. Did you see that gown? Like putting silk on a scullery maid. She holds the baby like she's afraid it will break. No maternal instinct whatsoever. I heard she can barely read. Translator, please. The emperor must be desperate. She endured it the way she'd endured everything else in her life, by making herself smaller, quieter, less. She attended the required functions, sat beside Cassian at state dinners with her spine straight and her face neutral, and retreated to the nursery the moment protocol allowed. Elian became her refuge. He didn't care that she'd been born in a charity ward or that the court thought she was beneath them. He simply needed her. For food, for comfort, for the sound of her voice in the dark. She sang to him, nonsense songs the nuns had taught her, and watched his serious little face relax into something close to contentment. In those moments, alone with the baby in the lamplight, she could almost forget that the rest of the palace wanted her gone. Cassian noticed. He said nothing directly, but she saw it in the way his jaw tightened when a noblewoman made a barbed comment within his hearing, the way his eyes tracked her across crowded rooms as if checking for wounds. He began appearing at the nursery more frequently, sometimes sitting in silence while she tended to Elian, sometimes reading official documents by the fireplace as if her presence helped him think. Once, when she'd been up half the night with a feverish baby and finally gotten Elian to sleep near dawn, she'd dozed off in the rocking chair still holding him. She'd woken hours later to find herself covered with a blanket that hadn't been there before, Elian safely in his cradle, and Cassian asleep in the chair across from her, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, official papers scattered across his lap. He'd stayed. Not because he had to, but because he'd wanted to make sure they were safe. The Senate convened again 3 weeks after the initial presentation, this time to formally ratify Elian's position as heir. It should have been a formality. The emperor had presented his son, the bloodline had been verified, the succession secured. But Senator Octavia had spent those 3 weeks building opposition, whispering in corridors, calling in favors, constructing a coalition of traditionalists who believed that an empress without noble lineage threatened the very foundation of imperial legitimacy. When the vote came, it wasn't unanimous. 43 senators voted against ratification, not enough to block it, but enough to send a message. Lyria would never be accepted. The Empire would tolerate her son, but they would never forgive her for existing. She stood beside Cassian on the dais as the vote was announced, her face carefully blank, while inside she felt something vital begin to crumble. She had known from the beginning that this would be hard. She had prepared herself for rejection. But knowing and experiencing were different things, and the weight of that public condemnation, 43 powerful voices declaring her unworthy, pressed down on her chest until breathing felt like work. The session ended. The senators filed out, and Cassian, without a word, took her hand and held it, his grip so tight it almost hurt. He didn't let go until they were alone in the corridor outside the chamber. Then he stopped, turned to face her, and spoke with a controlled fury that made the air around him seem to vibrate. "I'm going to destroy them." Not a threat, a promise. She shook her head. "No, that's not how this works." He stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "They humiliated you in front of the entire Senate. And if you retaliate, they'll say you're a tyrant protecting his mistress. They'll say I've corrupted you. They'll use it as proof that I don't belong." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "The only way I survive this is by being everything they say I'm not, by being steady when they expect me to break, by proving day after day that I deserve to be here, not because you chose me, but because I choose to stay." The seasons changed, and with them, the rhythm of the palace. Summer gave way to autumn, and autumn to the first bite of winter. Ellian grew, not dramatically, but in the small ways that marked time passing. He began to smile, first randomly and then deliberately, usually at Lyria, sometimes at Cassian when the Emperor made faces he would never make in public. He learned to grasp objects intentionally, to track movement across a room, to make sounds that weren't quite words but carried intent. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to transform the space between the three people who occupied the nursery wing, from a performance into something that felt dangerously close to real. Cassian's visits became routine rather than sporadic. He would appear after evening councils, still dressed in his formal regalia, and spend an hour simply existing in the same room as Lyria and Ellian. Sometimes he held the baby while Lyria ate dinner, bouncing him gently and murmuring about trade negotiations or military strategies as if the infant understood policy. Sometimes he sat in silence, watching Lyria work through the children's stories she'd begun reading aloud, her voice soft and steady. Once, when she'd looked up from a particularly dramatic passage, she'd caught him staring at her with an expression so raw and unguarded it had stolen her breath. He'd looked away immediately, cleared his throat, and made an excuse about needing to review documents. But the moment had lingered. The court's hostility didn't fade, but it evolved. The overt cruelty became subtler. Invitations that arrived too late to attend, seating arrangements at banquets that placed her as far from Cassian as protocol allowed, conversations that stopped just before becoming actionable insults. Lyria learned to navigate it with a grace born of necessity. She attended every function she was required to attend. She spoke when spoken to, with careful politeness that gave no ammunition. She never complained, never showed weakness, never gave them the satisfaction of watching her break. And gradually, a strange thing happened. The younger courtiers, those who had no investment in the old hierarchies, began to treat her with something approaching respect. Not warmth, perhaps, but acknowledgement. She existed. She endured. And endurance, in the brutal mathematics of court politics, counted for something. But the cost of that endurance was beginning to show. Lyria stopped sleeping well, her mind too full of everything she couldn't say, everything she had to hold inside to survive. She grew thinner, her appetite diminishing as stress consumed what food couldn't replace. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, makeup barely disguising them. She told herself it was temporary, that she just needed to push through until the court accepted the inevitable. But exhaustion had a way of eroding even the strongest defenses, and one night, alone in her chambers after a particularly brutal dinner, where she'd been seated next to Senator Octavia and subjected to 2 hours of thinly veiled contempt, she finally broke. She didn't cry loudly. She'd learned as a child that loud grief brought punishment, so her sobs were silent, her body curled in a chair by the window, shaking with the effort of keeping quiet even in her own room. She didn't hear the door open, didn't notice Cassian's presence until he was kneeling in front of her, his hands on her knees, his face level with hers. Lyria. His voice was gentle in a way she'd never heard it. Look at me. She couldn't. If she looked at him, she would shatter completely. But he didn't give up. He stayed there, patient and still, until finally she raised her eyes to meet his. And what she saw in his expression, concern so genuine it hurt, fury barely contained beneath imperial control, and something else, something softer that neither of them had named yet, broke the last of her resistance. I can't do this anymore, she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. I can't keep pretending that their hatred doesn't matter, that I'm strong enough to endure this forever. I'm not. I'm just... Her voice cracked. I'm just tired, Cassian. I'm so tired of fighting for the right to exist. He pulled her out of the chair and into his arms without asking permission, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other wrapped around her waist, holding her together while she fell apart against his chest. And for the first time since he'd whispered those 6 words in the Great Hall, he held her not as an emperor holding a political asset, but as a man holding someone he couldn't bear to see suffer. He didn't speak while she cried. He just held her, his hand moving in slow circles against her back, his chin resting on top of her head, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Time felt irrelevant in the cocoon of his arms. When her sobs finally subsided into shaky breaths, he guided her to the sofa, sat her down, and disappeared briefly into her bathing chamber. He returned with a damp cloth, knelt in front of her again, and gently wiped the tears and smudged cosmetics from her face with a tenderness that felt more intimate than any kiss. I'm sorry, she said, her voice hoarse. He shook his head. Don't apologize for being human. He set the cloth aside and took both her hands in his. I should have seen this. I should have known you were carrying too much. You have an empire to run, she said weakly. You can't spend every moment worrying about whether I'm... You are part of this empire, he interrupted, his voice firm. You and Elian. And if I can't protect the people who matter most, then what's the point of any of this? He gestured vaguely toward the walls, meaning the palace, the Senate, the machinery of power he'd inherited. I told myself that if I gave you status, quarters, protection, that would be enough. But it's not, because they can't take away your title, so instead they're trying to take away your will to keep it. His jaw tightened. And I won't allow it. She looked at him, this man who commanded armies and bent nations, and saw something she'd never expected to find. Someone as lonely and lost as she was, just better at hiding it. What are you saying? She asked quietly. He was silent for a long moment, as if weighing words he couldn't take back. I'm saying that this arrangement we made, this contract, this agreement, it's not working. Not because you've failed, you've been extraordinary, but because I asked you to live a lie, and lies don't sustain people. They consume them. He stood, began pacing, his movements agitated in a way she'd never seen from him. When I chose you, I told myself it was practical, strategic. You were invisible, controllable, safe. But somewhere along the way, he stopped, his back to her, his shoulders rigid. You became necessary, not for the Empire, for me. The confession hung between them, raw and dangerous. Lyria's heart was hammering. Cassian? He turned to face her, and the vulnerability in his eyes was devastating. I don't know when it happened. Maybe it was watching you with Elian, seeing the way you love him even though he's not yours by blood. Maybe it was your courage in the Senate, the way you told them the truth when any sane person would have hidden. Or maybe it was just... He paused, searching for words. Every quiet moment we've shared. Every time you didn't flinch when I was cold or cruel. Every time you stayed when you had every reason to leave. He crossed back to her, dropped to his knees again, and looked up at her with an intensity that made breathing difficult. I'm in love with you, Lyria. Not the performance, not the empress you're pretending to be. You. The woman who was born in a charity ward and learned 5 languages to survive. The woman who holds a baby like he's made of glass because she's terrified of breaking something precious. The woman who endures contempt with more dignity than most nobles show in triumph? She couldn't speak, couldn't process what he was saying. Love wasn't supposed to be part of this arrangement. Love was what made people vulnerable, what turned strength into weakness, what destroyed empires when rulers prioritized hearts over crowns. And yet here he was, the great Emperor Cassian Aurelius, on his knees in her chambers, offering her the one thing she'd never allowed herself to want, because wanting it hurt too much. "You don't have to say anything," he continued, his voice rough. "I'm not asking you to love me back. I know what I'm asking of you is already too much. But I needed you to know that this," he gestured between them, "isn't political anymore. Not for me. If you want to leave, I'll arrange it. I'll give you enough wealth to live anywhere in the world, establish any life you want. Elian will be protected regardless. But if you stay," he swallowed hard. "If you stay, I need it to be because you choose to. Not because you're trapped, not because you're afraid, but because you want to be here." Lyria felt tears sliding down her face again, but these were different. Not tears of exhaustion or despair, but something closer to breaking open. She'd spent her entire life believing she was the kind of person who got chosen last or not at all. That love, real love, was something that happened to other people. People who had families and histories and worth that could be